And as cities were cities in these former industrial belts like St. Louis, like Chicago, like Cleveland, you saw this flattening out of industry. And so this U.S. urban manufacturing was really struggling in the 1970s and 1980s to get a foothold. This is where we started thinking about and getting interested in brownfields. Brownfields become a major policy focus in the 1990s. And so these challenges of economic recovery also now are further compounded by these competition for industrial land. As I said in the intro, that a lot of these industrial uses are still attractive for developers, but attractive for different reasons. We only have to look at the City Foundry as an example of this, and not to say that I'm criticizing City Foundry or the entire what we now see as Cortex. Well, Cortex is there's still active industry in there, and it's still semi-industrial uses, it's startup uses. But the rest of the Forest Park Southeast neighborhood was historically an industrial, a lot of industry, a lot of worker housing in this neighborhood. But as urban manufacturing was struggling, a lot of these uses were converted. A suburban packaging plant at the corner of Tower Grove and Vandeventer is an example of that. So we had these competition for industrial land, for land. You also had the 2008 economic recovery that was considered a jobless recovery in manufacturing. It was jobless in that there was a flat change as we saw the recovery post 2008. There wasn't a lot of increase in manufacturing jobs, mainly due to technology and increases in different automation techniques. So fast forward to our current economic crisis as a result of COVID. The COVID recovery, though, is different from the 2008 recovery in that the focus really is on skills and talent. It was somewhat focused on skills and talent, but there was in 2008, but there was also a shift and an impact brought on by automation. So the COVID recovery is still taking shape. We're still trying to understand what that ultimately is going to look like. And so that's what this evolution, this Industry 4.0, IEDC, the International Economic Development Council is coined this phrase, Industry 4.0. Others are picking up on it. And this is where we think about, when we look at the history of manufacturing, a history of industry in not just the United States, but globally, started out with mechanization, with steam power. You've got the cotton gin, the weaving loom, the printing press, all of these different kinds of machinations that then started to allow for more factor specialization. So people were leaving the fields, coming into cities, because you had these giant factories with these machines that, yes, they were replacing cottage industry, but it was creating more demand for workers. So you moved forward to the Industry 2.0. This is where you have the mass production, the assembly line, electrifying around the globe, especially in the United States. We see a lot of electrification really having a major technical impact and technical improvements on local economies. And then you move into the Industry 3.0. That was the major industrial restructuring that in the United States and globally we witnessed in the 1970s and the 1980s. This is where automation really flattened out the production line, the assembly line, and a lot of what was originally done by factory workers, albeit it was very difficult work and backbreaking work, it was replaced by machines and computers and electronics. And so you see this shift and change. So Industry 4.0, this is sometimes referred to as smart manufacturing. It's the fourth industrial revolution, digital manufacturing, cyber it plays a big role, physical systems, there's the Internet of Things, you've got networks, you've got further automation that is much more enhanced and allows for different kinds of worker environments. To the point now, the question post-COVID is what about remote work? And then also what about the skills that are required to manage the employment needs and the workforce needs of the Industry 4.0. So as I talked about the forces of decline that led to the current situation where we're at, there was also on the policy side, there was this failure to invest, to competitively invest in manufacturing. So this is that global, post-World War II investment in Europe and Asia, that they were allowed to invest at that national level in a way that in the United States, they were nationalizing a lot of their industry. You see this happening in Germany. You saw this happen in Japan. They did not have the security expenses from a national or a global military. They didn't have to spend military funding. They were not allowed to per the Marshall Plan. So they were able to competitively invest in a systems-wide industry infrastructure. And so they were able to build up these kinds of technologies that allow them now to compete globally. In the United States, it was still very private sector led. And so some industries were able to invest, other industries were not. And so this reinvestment, while it added technology in certain situations, a lot of it led to job elimination. So you saw, and as a result, you saw a lot of population outmigration or sluggish growth. So you compound that with declining manufacturing jobs, and you see a lot of these massive population shifts in a lot of metropolitan areas. So St. Louis is a classic example of that. We had our metropolitan area has not ever lost population, but you see the dramatic declines, which I'll show in a moment, of population in the city. That is also coupled with the decline of manufacturing jobs. And then you can't discount affordable air conditioning. I know we joke about it in St. Louis about how there's two seasons in St. Louis. There's winter and air conditioning, but this idea of relocating to better weather had a major influence on the location of jobs in the manufacturing sector. As there were as air conditioning became more affordable at the firm level, the firms didn't have to locate in places like Chicago, Cleveland. They could relocate. That compounded with other adding in other kind of technological advances allowed more decentralization and spreading out of manufacturing around the country. This is where you saw a lot of investment in the 1990s in places like Birmingham, Alabama, or Chattanooga, Tennessee, where a lot of industry that left the industrial Rust Belt moved down to those other areas. So looking at the post-recession manufacturing recovery, this is, I've applied the cluster topology where you have, where we look at the combination of a local shift in employment, which means from an economic development standpoint, the way that economic developers will analyze a local economy, which sectors have locally competitive, are locally competitive in particular industries or in manufacturing or different sectors versus the rest of the nation. And then also a location quotient, which means the location quotient measures how much of a sector's output gets exported and how much of the sector's output is just for internal consumption within the region. And so you apply this kind of topology, a transforming sector would have maybe a declining local shift, but they have a high location quotient. So they may not be locally competitive, but they're exporting what they're producing. And so that would be a transforming industry. A growing industry has a local competitive shift, a growing local competitive shift, and also a high location quotient. So they are locally competitive and they're exporting. And then you've got your declining sectors. The declining sectors are declining in competitive advantage, and they're declining. They don't export what they produce. And then you've got your emerging, which they have a growing local shift, but they are not quite to that point where they are exporting. So we take a look at this typology across the United States, and we see what's interesting is to notice where you have growing manufacturing recovery. So we see a lot of it in the former industrial sectors, the Rust Belt, if you will, of Indiana, central to southern Indiana, southern Ohio, northern Ohio, the Detroit area in Michigan, Milwaukee, and the Rochester, Syracuse, Buffalo area in New York, where we have declining manufacturing sector, interestingly enough, is in Chicago, and then across California and the eastern seaboard, and then down in through Florida. So this suggests that there is a remanufacturing happening in some of these areas that were formerly known as industrial powerhouses. The emerging sectors, St. Louis is an emerging sector. And I think when we look at the components of the manufacturing sector, while some of it is traditional manufacturing, we're starting to see an emergence of other sectors, which I'll go into in just a minute. So as I said, as we've talked about the forces of decline, there are factors impacting development. So location matters. It does. It still matters, but on the manufacturing front, but not as much as it used to. So raw materials, the advances in shipping and trucking and supply chain, pre-COVID, meant that raw materials were easier to locate. Markets are easier to identify and ship to suppliers. And all of this is keep in mind, this is all pre-COVID, because as we know now, COVID has been a major disruptor of manufacturing supply chain. And so all of the typical influences matter, but not as much as they used to, especially now and then we factor in COVID with remote work, with supply chain disruptions. A lot of different changes are happening across the globe in manufacturing. So there's this impact of technology, post-recovery and post-COVID. All manufacturing is now advanced manufacturing. The term advanced manufacturing, in my humble opinion, just needs to be retired, because every manufacturer recognizes that in order to survive into the next several decades, they have to be more advanced in their incorporation of technology into their manufacturing process. And so there's more labor that's required. And so then the question is, less labor, maybe. Post-COVID, we're recognizing it's the requirement for skilled labor. Skilled labor, if anyone sat in on the State of St. Louis Workforce report that was the presentation last week, that was the major theme of that presentation of this year's current report, was skilled labor talent is front and center. And so we still cannot discount the impact of environmental changes, or environmental challenges. So reclaiming brownfields, obviously that's now something there's been some interest turned back to. How can we remanufacture the brownfield, make it a manufacturing location once again, but while understanding the liabilities. And then of course, I realized I left this off. Climate change is the huge wild card in all of this. It's anyone's guess what will happen, how climate change will impact manufacturing, but we know that it will. All you have to note it and see is the most recent EPA changes impacts on the Colorado River supply. They're pulling back on making the supply available, recognizing that the severe drought that they're currently struggling with in the West is having a major impact on water supply. So water is probably going to drive a lot of location of manufacturing in the coming future, in the near future, and climate is going to be driving the access to water. So in St. Louis, we've got a river. Yes, the river has struggled from drought in the past. I don't know how many of you remember several years ago in December when they actually had to shut down the shipping channel in St. Louis because the water was so low. So these are things we're going to have to think about. And we haven't experienced that level of drought in since then, but given the nature of climate change, it's entirely possible. Or we could be in a state of flood like 1993. So climate change is the wild card. So as I said, the influence of COVID has had a major impact on manufacturing. The National Association of Manufacturers, their 2020 survey indicated that more than 53% of firms anticipated changes in operations. And this was back at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and at the beginning of the pandemic when things were just starting to shut down. And so they anticipated changes in operations, but continued supply chain challenges that we're experiencing right now suggest that it's still creating major disruptions. And there's been, if we look at the price of construction materials, or you look at, the availability of various different just general food products. Look at what happened with PPE, what happened with toilet paper. Right now, there has been a continuing shortage, a lot of different supply chain disruptions in the pet food manufacturing industry. And some of that is due to production challenges around the actual raw material, but a lot of it is the availability of cans. I learned this from an engineering friend of mine who designs plants for Purina, and his take on it is that there has been a global supply chain disruption in the availability of cans for pet food. So these are still creating major disruptions, and we cannot discount the global political instability that is going to further impact the supply chain. There's still we are still dealing with and struggling with the supply chain disruptions from China, from when we had all of the tariffs and different political challenges in place, and that's going to continue on into the future. Also in that same survey, 78% of firms expect major negative financial impacts. And so we are noticing in the firms that we have surveyed that COVID, if a firm was nimble enough to make a pivot during COVID, they were able to figure out how to survive. But I expect the next NAM survey post-COVID is going to show a dramatic, not a shrinking of manufacturing, a change in manufacturing. And one of the interest areas that I'm looking at is what kind of an impact is it going to have on small to mid-sized manufacturers? Will there be a drift and shift over to the larger scale manufacturing when we see a shrinking of small and mid-sized firms? So this all suggests that the lean and mean manufacturing practices are being reconsidered. So lean and mean manufacturing was just-in-time inventory strategies that meant that you didn't have to have a lot of inventory on your balance sheet, which is what manufacturers historically were told. You do not want to have a lot of inventory on your balance sheet. You switched to the supply chain became this nimble system where you need your inputs come in 2 days before you need them or 1 day before you need them, rather than having to have several months of supply on hand. This is what is partly what's impacting the pet food shortages. So there will be some shifts and changes in lean and mean, the manufacturing practices. So these supply chain issues need to be reconsidered. So going back to St. Louis and the story that we all know, the population growth rates by decade. We know about the sharp drops in population in the 70s and 80s, subsequent slow growth. And yes, we have now dropped out of the top 20, the 21st most populous MSA. Likewise, the impact on the city of St. Louis, there was massive outmigration in the central city. There's massive outmigration of manufacturing jobs. And so we're looking at 70 years of population decline. And yes, we now know in 2020, the 2020 census, the city's population dropped below 300,000. Although there are many that are calling those numbers into question because of all the continued concerns and questions over the accuracy of the census count this time around. This is not a presentation to talk about that. I'm sure that somebody else could put together a presentation on that in the future. But all that's to say that there are people who have questions about the efficacy of the data that we're getting this year. So, but St. Louis is still a diversified economy. And we see these balances. So again, looking at location quotients by the top sectors, we see manufacturing, anything that has a location quotient of 1 or greater than 1, roughly around 1.25, is seen as a sector that is exporting. So 1 is the balance. In other words, you're producing enough for the region. You're not necessarily, you're not necessarily in decline. These are actually, so St. Louis, city of St. Louis is on the left and the metro area is on the right. And so we see that in 1970, there was manufacturing was still considered a primary export sector. In 2017, there was certainly a shrinkage of that as a general sector. However, in the work that I've been doing, going down into the subsectors, within the subsectors, there's quite a bit of variation, which I'll show in a moment. So balance, as we've said, does not necessarily mean growth. So we notice, just kind of another way of looking at this, just the trajectory of manufacturing versus non-manufacturing growth. We know that jobs in general have been in decline in St. Louis, in the city and the region. So the blue line are manufacturing jobs, the orange line are the non-manufacturing jobs, and the gray line are all jobs. And so we see we've seen a gradual decline, but you see a much more marked decline among manufacturing jobs. So taking another look at jobs from a spatial standpoint, this is from on the map, Census Bureau's on the map, showing job flows for primary jobs that are goods producing jobs. So we see there's still a fairly sizable number of workers who travel into the city, goods producing workers who travel into the city for their job, and then a sizable number of workers who live in the city and work in the city. And then we see an export of workers in the city who are working the goods producing sector that actually leave. No, they don't go east, they go all over the region, but this is kind of the way that the graphic works. So that means that there's still a significant component of manufacturing in the city, and so manufacturing is still important. And so when we look at it by MSA, or look at it by county within the MSA, St. Louis County is the leader in the share of regional manufacturing, followed by St. Louis. So St. Louis County has a share, 50% of the overall share of the MSA, followed by St. Louis County. The only other county that is close is St. Charles County, which not quite 10%. So St. Louis City and County is where a lot of the activity happens, the manufacturing activity occurs, and manufacturing firms are located. So getting back to the work that I've been doing, the work that I'm doing now is based on an initial study that I completed in 2009 after I was up in Chicago. I was very interested in looking at land use conversion around industry in the city. And this was, so we looked at parcels that had a shift from an industrial use to a non-industrial use. And we included K, the generic catch-all zoning code in the manufacturing component. And so anything that was formerly industrially coded that flipped to residential, formerly industrial code, those are in the yellow, those are the yellow dots. Any formerly industrially coded parcel that flipped to commercial in 2009 is represented by a red dot, and the black X's are vacant. So we see it's not a large number of conversions and this is based on city assessor data. And I recognize that sometimes that data is not as reliable. The land use data in the assessor files isn't necessarily as reliable as what we would hope, but barring any other global data set that covers the entire city. This is what we were working with. And so what that suggests is that there was a total 0.4% of parcels, or 0.4 square miles of parcels we witnessed. There were total converted parcels. So it's not a lot, but when you start picking away at industrial strength, especially when you look at the outmigration of jobs. And for the city of St. Louis, as they're trying to redevelop major corridors, looking at, keeping in mind the experiences in Chicago, when you have overabundance of residential uses that creep up onto an industrial area, you might start to see some softening of industrial uses in those areas, which from a fiscal perspective can have a negative impact on a city's balance sheet. So that's what led me to the interest in this. And then when Mark Bowers reached out to me wanting to do a more concerted study, that early study is what informed it. So look, as I said, looking at the city's subsectors by location quotient, while we saw the overall location quotient for the manufacturing sector as declining, when you look at the local share by subsector, we notice a few major areas that stand out. So food and beverage and tobacco products manufacturing is one sector that really stands out. Chemical manufacturing, that obviously Signer Aldrich, Monsanto, the work that they do in the city, there's a lot of chemical manufacturing so the dark gray is the local share and the light gray is the national share. So any of the columns that have a higher dark gray line means that the local sector is more competitive. So we see local share also in food manufacturing, apparel manufacturing, printing, paper manufacturing, and fabricated metals manufacturing. So those were the major subsectors that we were recognizing that actually were emerging sectors or growth sectors. In the case of food and beverage manufacturing, food especially, there was a major growth sector. There was major growth emerging in those subsectors. And so when we look at manufacturing by employment, this is from 2015. This was data that I had purchased from InfoUSA that showed where do we see mean firm employment by neighborhood. And we used this to start looking at industrial neighborhoods and where we're going to focus our interview efforts. And so this is what helped inform the manufacturing neighborhoods that we identified as Mark Twain, which is in the northwest part of the city, the near North Riverfront, which everybody's familiar with, downtown sector, then down into the South Riverfront, and the Carondelet neighborhood has a fairly sizable manufacturing sector. And then the Manchester corridor, especially as you get past Kings Highway on into Dogtown and the Hill, there's quite a bit of manufacturing on either side of Manchester Avenue. And then of course down Kings Highway. And so, we noticed that these were there's more of the significant manufacturing employment. And so these are then the firms that we interviewed. And I realized that the numbers don't, you can't see the numbers. I'll make all of this information available for that Justin can, or Christy can put on the website so you can look at this in more detail. So this is for the original study that looked at all of manufacturers in the city of St. Louis, and we chose to just focus on the city of St. Louis at that particular time, just simply for resource reasons. It was just me and a graduate assistant, initially Luke Henson, some of you may know Luke, followed by Paul Weatherford. And we just did not have the capacity to include the St. Louis County into the study at this initial study. And so these are, we tried to stay in manufacturing neighborhoods, although we did interview several that were in actual neighborhoods that you may not realize unless you live in the neighborhood. There were quite a few in Gravois Park that they had this little cul-de-sac, and in that cul-de-sac was a little cluster of firms that then were surrounded by housing. And these firms were very old, historical firms, legacy firms in the region that were happily coexisting with their neighborhoods. So we did these analyses of, we had a series of 5 areas of questions. So we asked them questions about process and product. We asked them questions about growth and expansion. We asked them questions about legacy and how do they see their future. And then we also asked questions about their location and real estate challenges, and then any experiences they might have with the city, with policy. And so the experience of these firms, most of their firms, they really like their location. They don't have any desire to leave. They weren't experiencing the same wanderlust that a lot of these Chicago firms were experiencing. Chicago was witnessing a lot of firms moving out of the area, a lot of them relocating to places like Texas and Alabama for supposedly cheaper workforce, which interestingly enough, in the research I've read, didn't hold up. But anyway, so these firms that we were interviewing, a lot of them legacy firms, they had no desire to leave, but they had little interaction with the city except with citations. And that was a big source of frustration for a lot of them. Now, admittedly, this is typically a population that is not very keen on government engagement. They're fiercely independent, these groups. A lot of these firm owners fiercely independent, and I hear quite an earful on certain occasions. But a lot of them expressed what I considered valid frustrations when they said they would get a citation for violating, for not having a permit that they didn't know they needed. So there is a disconnect and has been a disconnect between the city and a lot of these firms. Now, we've presented some of these findings previously to SLDC, and they are aware of this. And I know that there are a lot of efforts underway following the findings to make sure that there is more engagement and interaction to the extent possible with a lot of these agencies, or a lot of these firms. But more interestingly and more concerning is a lot of these firms really had no plans for the future. When we asked them questions about whether or not they were that they were thinking about succession plans and growth and what they would, who was the next generation of their firm, they didn't have any thoughts on that. And a lot of these firm owners were in their late 50s, early 60s. So this idea of legacy becomes a real problem at this point. And one of the concerns that we've had is what happens when you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of these different firms that each employ 20, 30 people. They just decide to sell or close up shop because there's nobody to take over the business. And so then you have some job loss. And a lot of these firms provide really good jobs that pay a decent livable wage and provide benefits that a lot of these workers otherwise don't have access to. And so one of the concerns that we have is this potential for job loss that is under the radar for a lot of places. And when we talked to these firms about the city development agency, they were very frustrated by the focus of the development agency, that it all seems to be about Amazon or about Cortex or, the next new shiny thing. Now it's Geo, and, they felt like they were forgotten. And I love this particular quote. "I have no interactions with the city. They don't even acknowledge we are here. They don't offer help. They don't come out and say, what can we do to help? How can we help you expand?" None of that. I know the city has agencies that do that. Maybe if I was Amazon, it would be different. And that's kind of the sentiment. While, some were less expectant of the city to come talk to them, but there was this feeling that they didn't feel like they could go to the city to ask for support because they didn't feel like they were big enough or the city might see them as worth the investment. So what we were noticing with this first round of interviews is that there seemed to be little evidence that there was concerted support for manufacturing as a whole, as a sector. That there was really more this, yes, Cortex has been a big issue, big focus. The redevelopment of the Central Corridor has been a big focus, but a lot of the commercial investment seems to supersede any strategic support for manufacturing as a sector. Now, the city's newest, the SLDC's economic framework does address this now. So there has been a shift and a change in direction. But what we were noticing is that a little assistance from the city can go a long way. And in these particular areas, in particular with infrastructure investment, providing low cost or forgivable loans, a lot of these legacy firms, especially in these neighborhoods, they had struggles with leaking roofs or other kinds of pipe problems. And for them, the repair was several $1,000s, and for them it was a major impact on their budgets. But if the city were to have some kind of a forgivable loan program, which would be a much more minimal investment on the part of the city, that would go a long way to keeping these firms afloat. The permitting process, and this is not just unique to St. Louis. I mean, permitting is a problem everywhere. Trying to figure out what's the best way to streamline that process. Is it a one-stop shop? However it goes, but it's always worth mentioning that the permitting process continues to be a struggle with trying to figure out the right mix of how to support firms who have, because it's not just at the city level, it's at the state level, and it's at the federal level. There's a lot of different kinds of permits, and sometimes it can be a real moving target for these small companies. Now, on the workforce challenge, these were our initial surveys happened before COVID. They were having workforce challenges, not too dissimilar to some of the workforce challenges that we heard from St. Louis Community College last week when they made their presentation on their report out on the state of St. Louis workforce. But the soft skills that everyone was talking about prior to the pandemic are not as big of a concern now as the talent, but still it's a challenge. So any kind of workforce strategies that create like an apprenticeship program can also blend in with these concerns of legacy issues on succession planning. So it's not just about the training for the front entry-level worker. Can there be some kind of workforce training program that can help train up management or train up into next generation succession for those firms that don't have plans to keep the company within their family? And so this gets to that whole support for if the city can come up with some kind of program to support succession planning. And so those were our initial findings, that the public sector investment priorities, they favor the Central Corridor. And this suggests this idea, there's a potential for further industrial gentrification, especially as you go further down Manchester Corridor. This idea that the industrial gentrification removes what were otherwise entry-level livable wage jobs from areas that were easy for a lot of city residents to access. And so these high-tech district and residential corridors, they seem to receive the most attention and investment, but these investment priorities, they place pressure on these former industrial neighborhoods. And so, as I said, there's a lot of people who are complaining that it was all about Amazon. These days, you don't hear that quite as much, but the sentiment is still there. And as I said, the small and mid-sized enterprises, these firms do not seek or receive as much public sector development. As I said, they tend to be wary of government, but they also don't seem to take the long view to seek leverage opportunities. And so this is where rethinking this relationship and how to get the word out to some of these firms that there are some of these leverage opportunities for investment, because the city does have a pretty sizable program focusing on manufacturing. It just doesn't seem to have gotten out to the small to mid-sized firms. They aren't as aware of what's available. And the other challenge that we've noticed is that when you see small to mid-sized firms shutting down or closing, they don't receive the public attention as that, say, Boeing might receive when they announce laying a layoff. And so while you look at the numbers, there might be larger numbers when you see the number of SME firms that shut down. It doesn't even get a notice in the Business Journal or the Post-Dispatch, but yet the net loss is larger. But the other surprising finding, and this is why we really are pushing this focus on small to mid-sized firms, is that the firms themselves tend to be more rooted in the region. They like the region. They have family here. They have connections here. They're not afraid of the crime. They're not going to go run off to Nashville because they think Nashville is going to be going to give them a better future. They are committed to St. Louis and to the region. The average length of employment, and that's not just the firm, but the employees too. The average length of employment for employees in these firms is 10 years. So there's a stability with these kinds of firms. But again, finding employable workers continues to be challenging. And so these next steps, as I mentioned, we are doing a deep dive into the food and beverage subsector. We just concluded the interviews back in June, and I'm in the middle of that analysis. I'm coding the data right now, unfortunately, I don't have enough of an analysis completed yet to give you any initial findings, but that will be emerging. It could be another lunch. Because food and beverage, what I was noticing in some of the interviews is that there was a lot of nimbleness associated with food and beverage manufacturing, and as a sector, is really taking off in the region. That set of interviews were region-wide. They're not just focused in the city. So it's a sector that the region can really is really benefiting from. And we've also just concluded an online survey of firms that St. Louis Make supports. I'm in the process of doing that analysis as well. And what the plans are for the future with this work is to develop a framework for a sensitivity analysis so that we can understand, this is my research side, that can influence policy. So what are the characteristics of the post-industrial manufacturing neighborhood? And especially post-COVID, how can the public sector investment have an impact, and thinking about these competing corridors and looking at the concerns about the potential for industrial gentrification? And then also, how will COVID influence the future of manufacturing? That's a next step study that I'm hopefully starting to build out and pursue with some colleagues in the business school. So with that, I will shut up and ask and wait for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Coffin. Everyone, if you would like to enter any questions you have for Dr. Coffin into the chat box, she would love to answer those for you, and we have plenty of time. I will start us off with something I was thinking about as you were speaking, Dr. Coffin. I'm wondering how this ties in the shifting attitude of wanting high school graduates to go on to college, and how it's less and less acceptable, or it's not as promoted to go into the trades or go directly into the workforce, and how our society kind of values going to college more than those things, and whether that entire attitude fits into this, and whether it's a regional priority for infrastructure investment and priority for our government, priority for the NIMBYs who don't want industrial in their backyard. How do you see that attitude fitting in?
So that has been a challenge probably for the last couple of decades. Me as a college professor who frets every year about admissions, as with my professor hat on, I'm like, oh no, everybody needs to go to college. But honestly, the reality is no. I think that we have done a grave disservice to the trade schools. And I think that shift is starting to happen. COVID laid that bare. And I think there is increasingly in urban areas a recognition that we need to skill up, train up, not with college, and not with these ridiculous trade schools that were scams that put a lot of these young people and not so young people into serious private debt. But from a manufacturing standpoint, absolutely, this is what we need. We need what we were identifying in some, especially in the near North Riverfront. There were some kids that were finding their way to these firms and becoming really solid employees and landing in landing in what they call the job ladder type of position that allowed them to move up in both training and experience and income. And so the State of Workforce report last week talked about this a little bit, and I think that there is a shift. If you look at the priorities coming out of President Biden's administration, there is a priority toward community college, which is seen as a place where you can scale up and start seeing more of this investment in this trade level education.
Great. We have another question for you, Dr. Coffin. Could you please give some examples of small and medium-sized manufacturing companies in St. Louis and also food and beverage manufacturing companies in St. Louis?
So any of the coffee roasters, we did interview several of the coffee roasters. Coffee roasters are an example. The microbreweries, certainly. Chocolate, we've got several that are not just, boutique chocolate shops. They are Bissinger's now owned by Chocolate. There's a tea company. There is, we interviewed a company that creates an additive for beverages that thickens the beverage, which is very important in therapeutic settings. So if you're working with a patient who has aspiration problems, so they have a hard time swallowing, and thickening the beverage, and it's a flavorless thickening. It's kind of my grandmother used to have. I remember it from my grandmother, but it thickens like water so that they can still drink the water, but they won't aspirate. In other words, they won't breathe the water into their lungs. So that was another one. There's all kinds of food and beverage sector, food and beverage manufacturers. I was surprised. Lots of sauces, lots of barbecue sauces, hot sauces, pickles, prepared food, prepared meat, sausage manufacturing. It runs the gamut. And I was really disappointed. All of our interviews happened on Zoom because of COVID, so we weren't able to do any sampling.
That would have been great.
Yeah.
So the next question, thank you, John Cruz, for making me read a long question. So John is wondering how we balance the need for the city to provide services versus the business owner's willingness to invest in compliance. Any of those business owners could hire an attorney or consultant to advise them on what permits they need or what programs they could access and navigate, but choose not to, and instead hope they will just be left alone.
Yeah, some of them, yes. But some of these are a lot of these small to mid-sized. I'm looking at more the small side. Those are the ones that really struggled learning about permits. Maybe they didn't have an attorney, or they couldn't. It's a good point, but what we were finding around the country when I was doing analysis of other cases, one-stop permitting shops that make it easier for companies who are, and a lot of these businesses, they'll bite the bullet and get the permit, but they're reluctant to invest in legal counsel for various reasons, but they're, especially if they're just starting up. So it's a hard one. I need to look at that question myself. I don't know if I'm answering it fully for you, John. Wondering how we balance the need. Well, I think that in the other, in terms of the balancing the needs, that certainly, that's a hard one because it's not, these are firms, while they don't want government involvement, they're also, a lot of them also are reluctant for handouts. So they're not ones to want the incentives, the abasement. I mean, they're, you talk about, a lot of times when I would mention tax abatement, they would prickle. They're like, I don't need tax relief. And so it's a different kind of a group to work with. But I don't know, John, if you want to jump in and clarify some of your question. I don't know if I'm answering it.
So from where I sit, it seems as though these are people who do not want assistance from the government, but also feel that the government should be assisting them in their permitting help process. Like, it seems like a little bit of a contradiction on my end. Like, if you really want to do it your own and take it, you know, I'm independent, I'm doing my own thing, you should be hiring the people that can tell you what it is that's going on, instead of feeling as though it's the government's responsibility to handhold you through the whole process. So it seems a little bit like a wanting a cake and eating it too, while also not wanting to put money in anything that could potentially damage their bottom line. And I agree that the government should make it as easy as they can to know what the permits are and know what's required, things like that. But as a small business owner, I feel like that's just part of your startup costs and things that you have to address is like, okay, I need to find a building, I need to get equipment, I need to hire people. I also need to ensure that everything I'm doing is legally compliant and I'm going about it the right way. So sure. That's where I'm struggling with the two sides of it.
Yeah, well, they weren't looking for handouts, and they weren't looking for, they weren't expected to have their hand held. I think the particular permits all stem from MSD, to be honest with you. And trying to figure out what you do and don't need can be a challenge if you don't understand what all the different permits accomplish. And so while you think you've got the permit you need, then you find out later you have a $350, the particular person in question, it was a $35 permit. They didn't realize they needed it. And then they got a $350 fine. And they got all the other permits. And for some reason, when they went to get this one permit, whoever never told them they needed this particular permit. And so that's what that's relating to. And so this streamlining it so that if you're doing X, Y, Z, this is what you need. So a one-stop shop permitting process is what we were recommending.
It sounds like part of what needs to be a comprehensive overhaul of a lot of procedures at MSD, and I'll leave it at that.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, the next question for you, Dr. Coffin. Have you heard any interest from companies in reshoring as part of their post-COVID strategies?
So the firms that we talked to during COVID were all small. They didn't have any, foreign investment. So I didn't hear of anybody, but I have heard anecdotally reading the news and different research that and NAM, I think, has been doing some surveys around this as well, that there is, actually reshoring was starting before COVID. Reshoring was something that was started when all of the challenges came up on with the tariffs and the big fight, the trade war that happened with China.
Got it. All right, next question. My understanding has been that the majority of manufacturing firms are located in rural areas. Is that your understanding? And if so, what factors might be in play to that end?
Actually, no, they don't all, the majority are not located in rural areas. It's probably an even mix, I think. If you look at the number of manufacturing jobs, St. Louis County leads. They have 50% of the MSA share of manufacturing jobs, followed by St. Louis City. So, but that's not to say that there isn't a lot of that there isn't manufacturing in rural areas. There is. I think it's more the larger some of the larger firms, but no, my experience was that most of them were in more urbanized or suburbanized areas.
All right. And also, can you speak to the city's Business Assistance Center and how it addresses some of these concerns we're talking about?
It does. And, getting to John's point, yes, it can be frustrating when when these are companies that just always seem to be whining about the government interfering with them. But a lot of them weren't aware of the business assistance center. And when we made them aware of that, then that's how they were starting to connect in. But the point that we were trying to make is that, and I'm not trying to point fingers at the city. It's not the city's fault. It's really just a real challenge because you've got industry here, manufacturers here, and the city's like here, and the city's got all these other things that it has to focus on and pay attention to, and industry trying to figure out how industry can connect with them when industry is when these businesses are not firms that naturally do that. But so somehow figure out how the two can connect, because a lot of these firms, not a lot of these firms, but some of these firms, they're, I don't want to say they're Luddite, but they're not social media savvy. They're so, obviously, so the city's really been doing a lot of work with social media, trying to get the word out. But so it's this challenge, and it's the age-old challenge that every city faces, is how do you get the word out about the resources that you have for your constituents. But yeah, I recognize that the city does have those kinds of support services. It wasn't very well known.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, so as of right now, that's the end of the questions in the chat. If anyone has last-minute questions, feel free to throw them in there now, or if it's quicker to just unmute yourself and chime in, you're welcome to do that.
Jim Hona just direct messaged me a question. Wanted to talk a bit more about the types of manufacturing in South Kings Highway and Morgan Fort areas. The firms that we interviewed in those areas, a lot of print manufacturers. There was this lithograph company, some sausage, a couple of sausage makers down South Kings Highway. And these are this is where a lot of the legacy firms that are in these little manufacturing neighborhoods. Now, whether or not they survive into the next couple of decades is anybody's question, but these are beautiful old buildings, but these are those beautiful old buildings that have holes in the roof and leaking pipes. And for them, they have a lot of physical plant neglect, infrastructure neglect. So, and this is a part of what, when I've had conversations with Beth Letcher at Cortex about this, when they first came in and started doing all their revitalization, a lot of the firms there that they were leaving because they had huge problems with their physical plant, and they just had to leave. So there wasn't a lot of manufacturing left in the neighborhood by the time they started the redevelopment area in Cortex. So, Jim, I'm not sure what's going to be the future of those, but those are they're all these. There's a firm in the Grow in south of Manchester in Forest Park Southeast that he has been buying up land around him. John Cruz, you might know who I'm talking about. But at some point, this is a firm that doesn't have any real succession planning in place, no family that's going to be taking over the business. And this person is up there in years. And so when they leave, when they decide to step down, I would imagine that somebody else will buy the business and move it. But, and I would think that probably will be what starts to happen in some of these smaller little manufacturing neighborhoods, micro neighborhoods.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Coffin. I'm going to hand it over to our president, Justin, for an announcement.
Hey, thanks. And Dr. Coffin, again, thank you for your time and your efforts to promote planning in our region and the work that you do with SLU. And, you know, hopefully as things progress with the program, this group that you've got assembled today can help move you forward as well. I did want to make one announcement. I just got confirmation that registration is now open for the 18th annual Certificate of Planning and Zoning through UMSL and the Missouri APA St. Louis section. And so we're really excited about that. I know I see a number of hosts and teachers on this call today. So I appreciate them being willing to participate in that program. I just want to let you know that should be in East at West Gateways newsletter. It'll be moving forward in our St. Louis newsletter as well. But please let your elected officials, planning commissioners, any you know, local activists that may not hear about that know it's a great program to get an introduction into planning and the importance of that in our region. So with that, again, appreciate you all attending this afternoon and hope to see you all in September. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.